Earlier, I said that a solution to the problem of political obligation would be an explanation of why we have an obligation to obey the state and its laws. Answering this question requires specifying what I'll call the grounds of political obligation. The grounds of political obligation are the facts that give citizens the obligation to obey the law. They're the facts that generate the obligation, that give rise to it. If you have an obligation to do something because of some fact, then that fact is the ground for that obligation. So for the rest of this part of the lecture, I'm going to introduce and assess some possible grounds of political obligation, some possible ways in which political obligation could arise. But before we get to that, let me give you an example that I think helps to dramatize the problem of political obligation. So suppose you're driving through a remote stretch of desert. You see a stop sign at a junction up ahead. You're driving slowly and you can clearly see that there are no other vehicles or any other people for miles around. Nevertheless, the law requires that you stop your vehicle, and now you're deciding what you ought to do. In this situation, you've no self-interested reasons or moral obligations to stop at the sign. After all, you won't be in any danger if you don't stop, nor will your passenger, and you know that there are no other vehicles for miles around. There's no chance of your being punished for not stopping. There are thus no self-interested reasons or other kinds of obligations to comply with the law. Despite thinking this and knowing it, you nevertheless stop your car. Your passenger asks why you stopped, and you give your answer. The law requires me to stop, and I ought to obey the law. In giving that answer, you take a stand on the question that we started with, whether we have an obligation to obey the law. You think that the answer is yes. Suppose that your fellow passenger asks why you have an obligation to obey the law. Now you're being asked for a solution to the problem of political obligation, a ground for the obligation to obey the law. Okay, now let me make one final point before moving on to the possible grounds for political obligation. Even if we have an obligation to obey the law, that doesn't mean that the obligation is necessarily decisive. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily what we must do. Rather, it just means that we have an obligation to obey the law. So showing that the problem of political obligation can be solved isn't showing that we ought to always obey the law. It would be enough to show that we have an obligation to obey the law. Okay, so even if the obligation to obey the law doesn't always outweigh all other obligations, it could still be the case that the problem of political obligation is solved.